Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Patti Peeples, CEO of HealthEconomics.com, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Real-World Data, Transforming Disconnected Data into Invaluable Insights, presented by Bill Fox, the CTO of Global Healthcare, Life Sciences, and Insurance at MarkLogic. Today's webinar will be a bit different than most of the webinars you've attended, and I think you're really going to like it. It's really more of a panel discussion, a forum with Bill that's forward-thinking and provocative. And you're a vital part of that, so I hope that you're going to join in. And we're really glad you're here. Before we begin, let me cover a few housekeeping items with you. You will see the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. As mentioned, the webinar is highly interactive, and we're going to be fielding questions both during the webinar and at the end. To ask Bill a question, just use that question tab in the control panel and do so at any time during the webinar. If you'd like your slides to appear bigger or smaller on your screen, you can do this by clicking on the screen icon in the control panel. This appears just below the microphone button. If you have any technical difficulty, please send a question using the question box on your control panel and we will handle it for you. A feedback survey to provide your opinion of today's webinar will be shared with you at the end. I really hope you'll complete this because we do want to hear from you. You may request the slide deck of today's webinar, and the contact details will be provided to you at the end of the presentation. And of course, an on-demand version of the webcast will be available shortly after the conclusion of today's webcast, and the link will be sent directly to you via email. Let me briefly introduce my colleague and our speaker. Please meet Bill Fox. Bill is Global CTO of Global Healthcare, Life Sciences, and Insurance at MarkLogic. He's an experienced attorney, consultant, and healthcare executive. And Bill has built upon 25 years of experience to become a nationally recognized thought leader in healthcare analytics, big data, program integrity, data privacy and security, and identity management. Prior to joining MarkLogic, Bill was Senior Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at MDN, a principal in Booz Allen Hamilton's healthcare consulting practice, and a VP of healthcare at LexisNexis. Welcome, Bill. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. Take it away.
Thank you, Patty. So am I. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the webinar. And, you know, I think we're at a really interesting crossroads with real-world evidence. Probably most of the people listening today have been thinking about this subject for a long time, thinking about health economics outcome research, but the developments of the last few months have really changed the game. And what we're talking about is that the FDA has really come forward, and you know, anyone who's worked with the government for a long time knows that most governmental agencies are pretty loath to make these kind of big announcements, and you hear the build-up for any time there's going to be an announcement from, say, the Federal Reserve. But the FDA has come out in the last few months and made some really bold statements. One, that the clinical trial system is broken, and there needs to be new ways to collect and utilize patient data. And that came from Janet Woodcock. And I mean, that's a huge game changer for us in this field, to start thinking about, you know, if you're at a big pharma, if you're at a healthcare payer and you're thinking about when is this going to happen, I mean, that means it's going to happen. And then Scott Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner, came in behind that and I think used the key term, which is the evidence gap that we need to close between the information that we're using now to make decisions and what actually happens out in the world. You know, it's interesting to think about that the idea of, quote, real-world evidence is revolutionary. You might think that all the evidence should be real-world evidence that we use to make these kinds of decisions. So that I think is the real setup for the discussion that we're going to have today, is that we're in a time now where the FDA has said, okay, guys, this is happening, and everyone is now thinking about how are they going to make it happen in their organization.
So, Bill, let me jump in here. Dr. Gottlieb has certainly been very vocal in value-based care, and particularly in some of his past positions prior to joining the FDA. and come out very clear in support of real-world evidence. And in fact, the current administration is giving a nod to some changing in government rules to ease negotiations between payers and pharma on pharmaceutical payment models that seek to evaluate value. Why are data so critical in the shift towards value-based care?
Well, I think that when everybody is going to take some risk, there's going to be the need for transparency. And I think that we're starting to see a tremendous change. And I think that this really points something interesting out. This just came out a couple weeks ago in JAMA, that a team of Harvard researchers replicated a 7-year clinical trial that cost tens of millions of dollars in 12 weeks using real-world data. So I think what we're starting to see, I think what we're starting to see is the impact that the change that's going to come when we actually start incorporating all the data that we can get our hands on in doing these studies. So it doesn't mean that every clinical trial or pragmatic trial is going to take 12 weeks, but if we can take a 7-year clinical trial and by incorporating a lot of real-world evidence, start to cut that down to 3 years or 2 years, I mean, that's extremely impactful on patients, on payers, on pharmas, on everyone. And that's, we really need to use the technology that we have available now, and also the collaboration between payers and providers and pharma to get toward a model that looks more like this than the present model that we now have been said to be broken. So if we look at what the value of real-world evidence is outside of that sort of stark example, is this is really the way healthcare and pharma should work. So we have this clinical trial model which is highly controlled, time-bound. A lot of research goes into the picking of the cohort, and that's been considered sort of the gold standard. But it leaves a lot on the table, and this is what we see at a lot of our customers and a lot of the people that I talk to, is that they're concerned about the amount of data that's sort of left on the floor that they know they have or that they have access to, but they can't currently use. So you're talking about bringing in data from electronic medical records and lab data, but also data from the hospitals, from Encounter, from registries, from pharmacies themselves. I mean, obviously, CVS is buying Aetna for a reason, and it's partially because now they will have much more fluid look at this covered life. And what we've seen that's really interesting is as we've moved from the meetings we were having with our pharmaceutical customers to the meetings around real-world evidence, the amount of people in the room can go up 10x. So instead of having a meeting with 4 or 5 people, whether it's about labeling or R&D or adverse events, when you're having that real-world evidence meeting, there's 40 people in the room, because it's going to affect all those lines. It's going to affect your understanding of biomarkers, of R&D, of the economic outcomes research, of value-based marketing. So it's going to affect every line of business as they actually re-platform their business for the age of real-world evidence. I think now we're going to ask our first poll question.
All right, we welcome everybody to participate in this poll. Tell us, what are your organization's main challenges to implementing RWE programs? And please choose one. Lack of IT expertise in big data, lack of communication between siloed business units, lack of access to required data, or lack of clarity around ROI for RWE initiatives. So take a moment to let us know what your predominant challenge is organizationally for implementing RWE programs. I'll give you about 5 more seconds to jump in on that. All right. So what you've told us is that almost a third of you indicate that lack of access to the required data is your predominant challenge. And then that's followed pretty closely by the siloed arena at which many of these business units work to communicate about said data. Clarity around the ROI for RWE is the least important, and that suggests that we've had a sea change about the relevance of RWE. So Bill, you want to talk a little bit about what those polls suggest from your perspective at MarkLogic?
Yeah, I mean, that's 100% in line with what we see. And like you said at the end there, nobody's really doubting, especially with these statements from the FDA, but I think beyond that, they understand what the value will be to their business and to patients when we really can do RWE. But the first two are really two sides of the same coin. I mean, the reason that they have lack of access to all the data they need is because most organizations are sitting on top of 30-year-old legacy data architecture. So they have dozens, hundreds, in some places literally thousands of data warehouses and data silos, and they're now trying to think about, now how do I bring that all together so I can use it? So the lack of access is mostly caused by this 30-year-old architecture. So life science companies want to use real-world evidence to demonstrate the clinical and economic value of the drugs, to accelerate the process like we just saw in that JAMA article, and to also better understand the patient journey and how they can do, translational medicine and have better outcomes for the patients. And those issues are the exact things that are stopping them from doing it. And that's really the discussion that we're having with the pharmaceutical companies that we work with, is how can we break through these silos, get around so that everyone can have. I asked a question at a seminar that I did in London. There were about 30 executives in the room, and I said, who has access to all the data that they need to do their job in the best way that they can? And not one hand was raised. So I think we've hit on the real problem in advancing this, in advancing real-world evidence.
Mm-hmm. So, Bill, at MarkLogic, I know that you work with a lot of different types of organizations, ranging from pharma to associations to health systems and payers. And as you mentioned, you have a perspective globally on this. So what kinds of healthcare data sets are these teams that are involved in looking at value? What kinds of data sets are they using to better understand a drug's value and how to present that to the payers and their stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, and that's, it's interesting that it's really all kinds of data sets. And I think what's really key is that there's probably a legacy belief that I've got to really think about what data sets I want to use. I've got to decide what they are. And that's a holdover from the way that relational databases operate, which is if you're going to combine these various data sets, you're going to have to decide in advance which ones they are. You're going to have to build a master schema. You're going to have to decide what questions you want to ask it. And that's not how MarkLogic works, and that's not how new gen technology works. So you've got these use cases. You want to optimize spend on marketing, on adverse events alerts. You want to avoid black box warnings. You want to improve and accelerate your clinical development. So really, you want to use all the data sets you can get a hold of, whether that's encounter data, outcomes data, lab data, data from social media, images, text, all the unstructured data, and to make that happen, it's so much more fluid in a database like MarkLogic, and you start to break down those barriers. So, this is the sort of what we talked about in the JAMA study with this huge market access challenge. And I remember seeing an article about probably a month or a month and a half ago that one of the big pharmas had announced a year or so ago that they had 11 blockbuster drugs in the pipeline. And then they announced a few months ago they were eliminating 2 of those completely. So you have to think about how pharma's looking at that business decision. There's $2.6 billion to develop a drug. And so they've got to look very carefully along that whole 10-year timeline and say, you know, we've got to cut our losses if we don't think this is going to pan out. And really how a lot of other businesses are looking at, you know, agile development, fast failure, let's try out the idea. Let's, you know, if you look at InsurTech or startups in the FinServe, it's really the opposite way of doing it. Let's start a whole bunch of experiments, see what's going to happen as quickly as we can, and then decide what we're going to do. So we're really hoping that the technology can change the way that we think about this market access challenge. So you reverse that trend by bringing together all the desperate data that's now a very arduous task to do and creating what's actually an agile data platform. You'll hear a lot of IT departments talk about agile development and businesses talk about agile development, but if you have a database, as we saw from the first poll, that is preventing you from having access to all the data, that's preventing you from breaking down those data silos, that severely limits how agile your actual development can be. So I think now we have our second poll question.
Okay, audience, let's hear from you. Tell us, how would you define the current stage for your organization's RWE programs? Select one. Are you at the incubation stage, investment stage, or maturity stage? And I know we've got a lot of different types of organizations, so I'm really curious about this. I'll give you just a couple of more seconds. Incubation, investment, or maturity? All right, let's close that poll. And it's split relatively equally between incubation and investment at about a third. Slightly more are still in the incubator stage, but I'm also quite surprised that a quarter of you say you're in the maturity stage. Bill?
Yeah, that is surprising, and it would be interesting to have a more granular discussion about that, because I haven't seen that. So the question then begs, you know, are those that believe that they're in the maturity stage with real-world data understanding the complete realm of possibilities? It's a very interesting book that I'd recommend everyone to read by some of my old colleagues at Booz Allen, called The Mathematical Corporation. And the sort of point of the book is, if you're an executive at a modern enterprise and you don't truly understand what can be done with data now in terms of databases like ours, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, if you don't really grasp that, then you probably can't even see the solutions that your organization can be bringing to market. So that part of the result is surprising. The other part is not. I think that most organizations are actually in that incubation stage or in that investment stage, where they're looking very hard at their legacy architecture, the solutions that they have available, and they're figuring out, okay, how are we going to leverage all of the data that we have and all the data that we want to get to really change the way that we do business.
So I encourage the audience to please feel free to ask us questions during this webinar. So if you've got something that's being covered or you want to add to the discussion, please go ahead and submit questions to us through that question panel. And I'm particularly interested in hearing from some of those that are at that mature stage. Tell us a little bit more about that. Bill, I want to ask you a question before you advance. With respect to the vast amount of healthcare data sets that are available out there today, in your experience, what are some of the best methods for collecting and analyzing that data in a timely manner?
So if you think about the data that's out there, who has it, where it is. What you really need is a multimodal database that can ingest all this data as is. The problem, the traditional problem or the legacy problem with relational databases is that they weren't built to ingest unstructured data. They weren't built to even ingest data from different schema that's all relational. So before you can even start to do anything, and this is what, we had a CTO of a larger organization say, well, the way that we would normally do a project like this is we would spend 18 months doing the requirements, meaning building out the master schema, understanding which databases we wanted to bring in, asking all the businesses what kind of questions they wanted answered. Then we would start building it. The way that it should be done, and the way that organizations that are starting to move into the next generation of database technology with us, is that you ingest all the data as is up front. In MarkLogic, all that data gets very granularly indexed and can immediately be queried, searched, data discovery can be done, but it doesn't lose any of the context from the schema. So it's a multimodal database. There's semantics, you can add RDF triples, ontologies, taxonomies, geospatial, and then you can actually start right then and there to build out the solution. So the real key differentiator between the way things were being done and the way things should be done now is if you're looking at this slide and you think about where all this data is, it's coming from pharma, it's coming from the payers and providers, it's coming from other stakeholders. Maybe you're purchasing those data sets, maybe it's SynPuff data from CMS, and then there's the clinical data from the EMRs. And then this, we're not even talking here about images and social media and IoT. If you want to be able to bring all that data in, you need to fundamentally change the platform that you're using to do that. So that data, as I've said a couple of times, it's in silos now. And this is what the architecture at most large healthcare enterprises, whether it's a big hospital system, whether it's a large pharma, or whether it's a big payer, this is what most of the architecture looks like now. So you have this sort of traditional, your data marts, your data warehouse, you have archive data, and now you're starting to get into this unstructured data. They probably have built a Hadoop database, a Hadoop data lake somewhere, and maybe are coming to the realization after a couple years of doing that Hadoop isn't a database, that it's a file system. So they might have added a bunch of stuff onto that, but there's governance issues, there's provenance issues with that. So they've got this is what they're sort of looking at. And it makes, when you start thinking about real world evidence, it makes it a very big lift. It seems very complex and very expensive. And this is what that's created. So about 80% of the time, a friend of mine who's the EVP of analytics at a big payer calls this his data integration tax. So every time you want to do a project that hinges on data integration, about 80% of the time that the data scientists are wasted wrangling the data. 60% of the cost of the project is going to be doing ETL. And there's a $3.5 billion business now doing ETL scripts, extract, transform, and load. And that's what a database like MarkLogic eliminates, is that traditional upfront waste of time and money and spend before you even can get all the data together and look at it. So I think we're going to ask another poll question now.
All right. So I've got a couple of questions from the audience. We're going to deploy this poll and get that. And then, Bill, I'm going to share with you a couple of questions from our group out there.
Perfect.
So everyone, please share your views. When working with RWD resources, what is the most challenging obstacle to expediting workflow and achieving faster time to insight? Please select one. Is it time cost, data quality, data governance, or data linkage restrictions? Choose one with respect to data sources. All right, Let's look at what the obstacle is in workflow. Data quality. I think you were talking about that at the top of the hour, Bill. And then that's followed by data linkage restrictions, and then bringing up data governance as the third most important. You have some comments about that?
Yeah, so you could almost combine, when you think about governance, quality, linkage, you kind of get back to sort of an MDM or master data management issue. And if you think about the slide I showed a couple slides ago with that, the way that the underlying deep architecture looks like at most of these large enterprises, you can see how that happens. There's multiple replicated copies of data. It's very hard to keep track of where that data came from. We've had instances with data lakes where we have CIOs and CTOs telling us, well, yeah, somebody asked us, well, that's great data, where'd it come from? Well, I don't know, because I've lost that part of the data, that context. So as you start thinking about this master data management problem, that's when you start thinking about having an operational data hub where you're not have separate parts of the business. We talk about closing the distance between observing the business. So you have this sort of data lake and your data scientists are in there doing analytics. And then you have all these operational platforms that are separate. Well, in our database, in an ODH, we call it an operational data hub. That is where everything runs off that. The analytics can run off it, the operational part can run off it, the transactional part can run off it. So I think that as you move toward a next-gen database and a next-gen architecture, you start to, as part of that process, you start to cut down on the problems around governance and security and provenance and data quality.
All right, Bill, let me ask a couple of questions here. When you, a couple of slides ago, you were talking about multimodal data. What technology platform is best suited for that? And the questioner says a Mongo database.
Yeah, so what I was talking about was actually a multimodal database. So a database that actually, so our database, for instance, unique from Mongo, has geospatial. It has deep granular security built in. It has RDF triple capability or semantic capability. And it has Google-like search. It was actually started by a search. The founder was a search guy. So this is all in the database. I'm not talking about a stack where you take some open source product like a Mongo or a Hadoop and you start putting things on top of it to do all this stuff. This is actually all native in a true enterprise database. So actually something open source like that is usually not what we see our enterprise customers putting mission critical, transactional, operational solutions on. They're not going to run the business on that. They're going to run the business on a true enterprise database, which gives them all the sort of features that they had on their old, probably Oracle database, but in terms of high availability and security and disaster recovery and all that, because they can't risk any of that. If you are at, we're at the largest banks, at the largest insurance companies, at the largest healthcare payers and pharmas, they can't risk any of not having any of those features, but what they need is all the features that we've been talking about. So it's finding an enterprise database that can actually handle all that, including all of this ACID and can do operational transactional stuff, and building on top of that so you don't have to go back at some point and take apps and solutions that you've built on open source off of them and move them over to a database, a more trusted database.
Thank you. We've also got a question about the OMOP in real-world evidence use cases. Do you have a perspective about that?
Well, I think it's an interesting issue, and I mean, you may have a better perspective on this than I do. But farmers are sort of in the, I think, deciding stage about whether they're going to be part of that or not? I'd be interested in hearing, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it really varies across the different organizations in terms of the I would say the risk kind of behavior that comes from the top down within the pharmaceutical company. I think that we're seeing some good advances with that, and regulatorily we're being driven in that way. Audience, who's participating in that? Let us know where your organization is standing on the OMOP, if you would. Bill, I've got one more question I want to ask you is, how can technology help ensure that the HOR efforts are delivering ROI and are able to readily adapt to changes, such as those regulatory changes or the payer requirements?
Yeah, I think that really rolls back into what we were talking about on one of the audience questions, is the best way to understand what the ROI is going to be for a project is to actually get the project going. So as we talked about in the first poll question, there seems to be very little doubt now that the ROI from building a real-world evidence platform and being able to use all that real-world data is going to be high. And it's pretty much based on the FDA statement, it's going to be a necessity. It's going to be existential. That is how you're going to eventually have to prove these things to payers and as well to the regulators. But one of the things we see from being an organization that works across a number of industries is if there's regulation 1, there's going to be version 2 and version 3 and version 4. So if you build in a platform that's not agile and say, okay, I got my solution built, I can do my reporting for this regulation, and then it changes 2 years later, and you end up starting over. So I think as you think about agility, whether it's in terms of regulatory reporting, whether it's in terms of understanding the RWI of a certain way of doing things, the more agile your platform is, the easier it is to add data sources, take out data sources, do different kinds of reporting. And when we think about reporting, it sounds pretty simple, and we think about Tableau, and I just like to create a report. But if that report requires a lot of data from a completely different database that at this point is siloed, it can actually be a huge lift. So the more agile the database is itself, and we'll talk about this and I'll be showing some slides, the better off you're going to be when those regulatory changes and business model changes come.
So Bill, you have on this slide social media, and one of our audience members is asking, combining social media data with claims and other data may pose a difficulty in the U.S. due to the potential risk of patient identification. Do you have a solution for that? And how do you manage that in terms of a dynamic patient journey?
Yes, I think you sort of have to unpack that in 2 different ways. So that's absolutely right, that if you are thinking about sort of tracking an individual's social media, that creates all kinds of HIPAA-related, privacy-related, permission-related questions that's going to have to be answered kind of on a solution-by-solution basis. Is it worth it trying to seek permission from those people to have access to their social media? There's other uses of social media too. If you're looking at sort of outcomes or trends or adverse reporting that don't necessarily have to be tied to the individual whose social media feed it is, but if people start talking about a reaction to a drug, or my kid's getting sick from this, or something's happening that way, the ability to see that early, whether or not it's identified to a certain person. Obviously, there's a lot of good to come from a quick intervention based on knowing who it is, but that does raise all these privacy concerns. But at least if the organization is seeing it early, it can react earlier to that. So I think that's it is in fact a very sticky question. I think the more granular the sort of access and security that you can build into the database, and that is something that we think about a lot and do. It allows you to create sort of those more fluid solutions, but there's no sort of easy answer to those privacy questions. So let's look at, sort of what this might look like. If you make the investment in this new technology, what does it start to look like? So researchers, analysts, end users are going to look at real-world data for a lot of different purposes, and at a high level, they want to see the impact of the drug or the therapeutic intervention based on a particular cohort with data from all these sources that we've been talking about, along with the context that comes from the ontologies, vocabularies, taxonomies that they want to put into that. So what you want to be able to do is put in all these different data sets and vocabularies together, and to bring it together, you not only need the sources of data, but you need all this associated information that can harmonize that data into a view that the researchers and analysts can really get ROI from. It's that harmonized, aggregated view that allows the end users to ask the right questions of the data, to search the data, to figure out what they want to do with it, what's really there, what's not there that they might need, and how they're going to build these solutions. So if you have an agile data platform, a multimodal data platform that we've talked about, then you can start to get something that might look like this. So, and this is what MarkLogic brings to the table, is by putting all this data together, allowing real-time research of it across many, many variables. On this screen alone, we're seeing claims data that was brought together with Truven data, with CMS SynPuff data. All this has been harmonized into a format like OMOP, which we briefly discussed. You can explore that data or filter the data via the various facts required for a cohort. You can see it enriched, as you see in the picture, with geospatial data. You can drill down by drug classification, whether that's generic or brand. And all these queries and all this information can be saved so that you can integrate it later with other analytic tools such as R. So what you're really looking to do, and somebody asked a question about a multimodal database and what that means, is have a database, have at the bottom of the architecture, at the base, where all this data needs to get ingested and made sense of and given context, a database that brings all this together in one, so that you're not creating this very polyglot, fragile architecture, but you have a database that has all this inside it, the security, governance, provenance that people mentioned, were key problems and key limitations. I mentioned that this comes down to an MDM problem. Bitemporality we haven't discussed, but that's the ability to see what the database looked like at any given time without rebuilding it, just the ability to see it. Obviously the query and search and analytics, and then very importantly to be able to do this sort of operational and transactional, so you sort of cut down the distance between observing your business and operating your business, and having that all in one database.
So Bill, you come from a deep expertise in privacy and cybersecurity and that sort of thing. With this growing threat of cyber attacks and thefts to personal health information, how can we go about ensuring that the data are protected?
Yeah, so we didn't talk about this, but in a prior life, I was the Deputy Chief of Economic and Cybercrime at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia. So, and also at the DA's office, and I believe that we were the first cybersecurity unit in the DA's office in the country, and now we're talking 15 years ago. So I've been looking at this for a long time, and everything we've been talking about comes down to this sort of sharing is caring model. We need to be able to share data both internally in our organization, see all that data, but also sharing of data between pharma and payer, between hospital system if you're doing a pragmatic trial, between the patient who might want to share their data in a study, and anyone who opens a newspaper or watches the news or has a phone is seeing that security is a huge issue. So the average cost of an incident has gone up to $7 million plus. the trend is quite scary in terms of how much more frequency there is. And I saw a statistic yesterday, I don't know where it's from, but it said that 83% of providers reported that they had some kind of cybersecurity issue in the last year. So what we talk about a lot, and you know, this is sort of a chicken and the egg thing, is that the database is super secure. Part of it is because the industries that we happen to be very penetrated into are Intel, life sciences, healthcare, financial services, and insurance, which are all industries for which hold a ton of privacy regulated data and require the kind of database that can accelerate these, you know, things like RWE. And the way that we think about it is moving security farther and farther down into the data architecture. So if you're just looking at the API level and somebody gets the key for the DBA, they're just in, and it's party time, and they get all the data. So, and also it's very difficult when you have data security policies and you're pushing them out to the businesses and you're saying, okay, businesses, we want you to make sure that all those data warehouses that you have and all those data silos and all those data marts all comply with all these rules we have now. That's very hard. So we believe that you should push the database security into the database level, so when a person from that business wants to see a document, when they bring it up, they only see what they're allowed to see. So whether that's through advanced encryption or very fine-grained role-based security, very granular data anonymization and redaction, to be able to do all that stuff in the database, then you can cut down a lot the burden on the businesses to have to do it themselves, as well as hopefully when you do get hacked, because generally most security people will tell you now that it's a matter of when and not how, and that's why you're seeing regulations like GDPR in the EU. So especially for pharmas who are all global, I would say there's not one pharma that we deal with where we're not dealing with both their office in North Jersey or Chicago or California, but also the one in Switzerland or the UK or Japan. So GDPR applies to all our pharma customers, and so, you know, beyond what they're thinking about now, if there's a breach, I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to do the other thing, the reputational damage, they're also going to have these GDPR security regulations to deal with.
All right, I think I've got one more question here. If all of the industries are undergoing some digital transformation, and that certainly is spreading across just about every industry across the globe. Just talk specifically about what's different about pharma and RWE versus the general industry in terms of digital transformation.
Yeah, so I think when you think about digital transformation, that's one of the interesting things, is that we are talking to business leaders and IT leaders in a lot of different industries about this. Is, you know, both the commercial, because of that slide we showed before that showed the $2.6 billion and 10-year journey to get a drug approved, because of the statements coming out of the FDA, we're now the main regulatory and approval agency for pharma saying, we're going to do this. You know, it's been estimated there's a $100 billion commercial opportunity, but on top of that, and what you have in pharma is the opportunity, the health opportunity for patients at the other end of this spectrum. So the ability to sort of fundamentally change the way that we do healthcare, the delivery of drugs, the cost of drugs, the cost of developing drugs, and the ability to deliver better patient journeys, and in the end, better outcomes. So, you know, where we come into this nexus between the real world data, turning that into real world evidence, turning that into outcomes research, doing the translational medicine and saying this is the best way to treat this patient, this is the journey they should be on, this is the drug we should be using. It's huge in every industry. You know, there was a survey of 500 C-level execs, and 85% of them said that they're going to allocate a quarter of their total budget to transformation in 2018. I think that's a difficult thing for a pharma to do because traditionally they're so focused on the process of discovering and manufacturing the drugs. And what becomes interesting is if you think about the sort of, there's a book called Third Wave Innovation by Steve Case. And what he talks about there is you had this like first wave of sort of everyone gets involved in the internet and the online world, and then you have Facebook and Uber and the way people and patients in particular want information delivered. And where we're at now with digital transformation and where we're at in pharma with digital transformation is how do you do this in a real industry, in an industry like pharma, banking, healthcare, insurance, where there's tremendous capitalization, there's tremendous risk if something fails, and you're changing the engine in the airplane while it's flying. You can't just stop and do this stuff. So again, this goes back to what we've been talking about, since the top of the hour, which is by bringing in next-gen database technology to start the journey of, okay, now I can see all my data, I can bring it in, I can bring in new sources of data. I can explore different solutions and different ways of doing this without the tremendous cost and sort of upfront waste of time and money and my researchers' time and my other employees' time. That's how we can bring this third wave of innovation into pharma. And, that's really what we're doing, and we're doing it in some of the largest pharmas in the world. This is a real thing that we're doing, Fortune 50 pharma company, and this is sort of the start. Is with all your data, there's a lot of metadata attached, and that metadata is extremely important. We talked about governance, we talked about provenance, we talked about context. So being able to put all their data together and have this sort of metadata catalog for that data, query across all that data. And remember, Google's fast because when you search Google, you're not searching the internet, you're searching Google's index of the internet. And in essence, that's what we give pharma organizations and other organizations when they put that data into MarkLogic, and then they can very quickly see and build specific searches. In this case, whatever the cohort you want is, patients over 35 with diabetes, COPD, and thrombosis. You can do that in seconds. And then if you decide, well, I really need these other 6 databases too to be in there, you just do it. There's no downtime there. So being able to do that is really going to help pharma, we hope, get over the tremendous hump they have to in order to go from the traditional way of doing clinical trials and discovering drugs through this multi-billion-dollar and decade-long process and approaching that sort of JAMA article that we looked at where in 12 weeks they look at all this real-world evidence and recreate that. And, we're doing that across, a whole bunch of different companies in both healthcare and pharma. We're in a lot of different sectors, and, it all basically comes down to giving this 360-degree view, whether it's of your own data in terms of real-world evidence, of the metadata, of looking at the patient or the consumer. It's basically around being able to give you that view of all the data, do it quickly so that you're not theorizing and doing requirements and talking about what you're going to do, but you actually dig into the data and start doing what you're going to do.
All right, Bill, I think we've got about 11 minutes left. Audience, we're going to devote this to our Q&A, so I encourage you to send your questions in if you haven't already. In one of the earlier polls, data quality was a really significant issue, one of their significant issues, and not only data quality but completeness. How does the MarkLogic platform help proactively identify those issues around that?
So what we've seen in a lot of organizations is they think that their data is a certain way. They're confident that they have data A, data B, and data C. When they get it into MarkLogic and they can actually see it and start asking questions and doing queries and doing that kind of data discovery across these varied data sets, they can very quickly discover where those gaps are or where the quality of that data is not what they thought it is. Now, obviously, there's no hot solution for fixing data quality problems, and various organizations have different data quality problems. I've worked with a lot of Medicaid agencies and things like that where data quality is a really severe issue. But again, it rolls back to sort of the same point. When people think about this, they think about it in old technology terms, how hard it is to sort of do that data discovery, understand what you have and what you don't have, where there are gaps, where you need to improve the quality of the data, and how to do that by using a database that makes the data discoverable really quickly and easily and across whatever schema, whether structured or unstructured. You can start to really quickly address those problems.
Thank you. We've had a couple people that are querying about the global nature of the platform. How are you managing with global databases, different languages, different kinds of architecture that are challenging from a worldwide perspective?
Yeah, so we have a number of global customers, particularly in pharma, financial services, because those organizations just tend to be global. We have offices all over the world, Europe, Japan. I was just at our office in the Philippines, Singapore, Australia. So, we have a lot of language packs for the database itself. So that helps a lot. You can get those language packs so that you can operate in different global localities. But I think that's a little different than the question about sort of global data. So one of the features of this database is that to us, and it's sometimes a difficult conversation with customers because everybody wants to believe that their data is very special. And they're used to having this conversation around, well, like our data, do you understand healthcare data or pharma data or banking data? And when you have a multimodal database that is schema agnostic but schema aware and can also ingest unstructured data as is, that sort of the differences in the data that are in different databases around the world sort of goes away. So there is always obviously the language issue, and that has to be addressed. But the data itself from these global organizations, that's not really a problem in this type of database.
Thank you. And so when you talk about real-world evidence, selection bias is always a predominant issue in this, and assessment bias. Do you have any perspective on those kinds of issues with respect to the MarkLogic platform?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I read the same sort of articles. There was a recent big furor around the fact that it was discovered that even AI tools can have selection bias. And because in the end, they're programmed by people. So, I don't think that selection bias is a database issue, but one of the things I've talked to a lot of customers about over the last few months as they start to think about AI and machine learning, and they're seeing this, is that those solutions will only be as good as the data that they're fed. And it's almost as if a lot of customers and enterprises, they want to skip over fixing the data, and they want to plug these really cool next-gen AI ML solutions right into their old crappy siloed databases. So we've had these polls, and people are saying the data's siloed, I don't have access to the data, there's governance problems, there's security problems, there's quality problems, but I want to do AI right now. So I think what we're addressing here today throughout the whole conversation is that the first step, and it's probably, you know, a more fluid and an easier step than some think, is to get the data into this type of database where it can be, where you can do the data discovery, you can look at the data quality, you can curate the data, you can add ontologies and taxonomies, you can do all the things necessary, geospatial tags, to then when you're feeding that curated data up into those other solutions, then you're going to get the real ROI and the real power of those solutions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of logical sense. Let's we've got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to delve into this question about regulatory compliance. Can you talk a little bit about how the MarkLogic platform would address some of those compliance issues?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about a real example rather than theory. You know, after the financial crisis, banks were hit with a tremendous amount of regulatory pressure and new regulatory requirements. So a lot of those banks had architectures where they might have 20, 30 plus trade stores spread out all over the globe, and they were doing that, the traditional reporting, the reporting they had to do before the financial crisis, out of each one of them. So each one of those 30 or so you would report out of. It became basically an impossible problem with Dodd-Frank and MiFID and other regulations that came into play after 2008. And therefore, they had to combine those 30 operational databases into a platform that they could do all the reporting out of at once. So to be able to do it in a timely manner, to be able to do it in a manner that wasn't extremely inefficient and very expensive. So when you think about regulatory, you have to think not just about how do I create a report, but what data do I need to create that report. If the FDA starts to roll out over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to start accepting this kind of evidence in this form, this kind of evidence in this form. I mean, you had last year with MIPS and MACRA, you know, they said, this is how we're going to do it, and doctors, you're going to have to be able to do all this stuff with MIPS, and we're going to expect this stuff to come right out of the HR. Now it's all changing. That's going to completely change. So I think the key thing with regulatory is, one, obviously, if you can't meet present regulatory reporting requirements, you've got a burning issue. But when you think about what's coming down the pike and the ability, you're going to start having more and more data together. You're going to start sharing that data internally, sharing it with other endpoints, whether those are patients or hospitals that are involved in a trial that you're doing, or a payer that you're doing value-based care with. You're a global organization, so you have to think about GDPR. So I think the idea is to come back to this idea of I need a agile, multimodal data platform that is going to allow the people that are tasked with doing this regulatory compliance, both work and reporting, to be able to do that in a timely, efficient, cost-conscious manner.
Thank you, Bill. All right, I'm going to ask you to put on your future-oriented hat, get your magic 8-ball out. And you've been working in this industry now for a couple of decades. I don't know if 15 years ago, when you were working in that in cybersecurity, if you knew where you'd be today. But where do you think this industry is going to be in 15 years? What are you going to be talking about? What are going to be the issues?
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation. I was having that conversation with our enterprise CTO yesterday, because I was reading some stuff about causation versus, you know, just being a coincidence. And if you think about where big data is going to go and how granular we'll be able to get and the number of inputs, one of the issues in security is, you know, passwords are just dead. Biometrics are tough because if somebody hacks your biometric, you can't get a new finger. So eventually, security is going to come around to being the same way that you recognize someone that you think you see on the street in New York City who you haven't seen in 3 years. Why would they be here? Is that really them? What are they doing? So I think that that's where we're going to go with all this. It's going to be the more data we get together, the more granular it gets, the more we'll be able to make really smart decisions based on that data.
Fantastic. I want to thank everybody for joining us. You've been a great audience. You've been really participative. Bill, you've given us some really thought-provoking ideas to ponder, and I hope it's given everybody a better understanding of how you can more efficiently and effectively transform your disconnected data into valuable insights in your organization. Again, don't forget, fill out that post-webinar survey. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to reach out directly to Bill and his team, the information is up there on the screen. And watch your email for the on-demand version to share with your colleagues. And I want to thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time to talk about this important subject. Bill, thank you and your team for sharing your insights.
Thanks, Patti. It was a great conversation.
Goodbye.